when the Essex hundreds of years ago was hit, why do you think that happened in the first place? The motive of that whale, or probable motive?
It was a bit of a puzzle, even to the people at that time, because sperm whales didn't have a reputation for doing this kind of thing. I've looked at the accounts of the people who survived it and went on to write about it, and it looks to me that what happened was this large male sperm whale initially accidentally hit the boat, because when it first hit it, it wasn't going very fast, 3 knots, which is just a bit over the average speed of a sperm whale at the surface. And then after that, it just lies beside the boat, sort of thinking, what the hell was that? And then it moves off, and at that point, it looks like it gets pissed off, and it turns around and it comes in at 6 knots, perhaps a bit more, which is quite fast for a sperm whale at the surface, and it rams it, and it I don't know about deliberate, it rams it in one of the weakest points of the ship, just under the bow of a fairly rotten old ship, and that sinks it. So, my interpretation, and I think this is shared by some of the people of that era who knew about these things, was that the initial contact was an accident, but then the whale got pissed off and decided to take things a bit further to the top. Anyway, I'm being a bit anthropomorphic here, but that's kind of how I interpret it, because they are generally, pretty timid creatures. And we've had large males coming in towards our boat, and I'm thinking, the Essex, but they always just veer off or dive under, and off they go. So
whalers usually targeted the large whales, the males, and there was a bias in the animals that they were taking. Can you tell us what that probably did to the populations and maybe even their cultures?
I don't think it's super clear that they were enormously biased in that era. Probably if they had the choice of a big male and a female side by side, they'd go for the big male. But it's not obvious that they preferentially killed the big males. That's very unlike the modern whaling, the modern steam and diesel-powered whale ships of the 20th century, who really went for the males, and of course, a large part of that is that they had the means to do so. The earlier guys who were rowing their boats, weren't particularly able to chase whoever they liked. They would just, go for the whale that was closest. But the 20th century whalers, they'd look around and say, oh, look, there's a big male over there. And if particularly they had quotas, how many whales they could take. So for them, a big male was way worth it, because sperm whales are, very dimorphic. The males are 3 times the mass of the females, so probably about 3 or more times the worth of the females. And you get to a stage in the 1970s of Peru where there were no large males left. They killed them all. I mean, at the beginning of that era, you look at the whaling, and they were mainly going for the big males in the 50s, but by the 70s they haven't got any to go for. They've killed them all. At that point, they're going more for they have to go for the females, because that's all there is. If you get the extreme case, as of Peru, where almost all the large males, or really actually all the large males are gone, then there's nobody really to mate with, and the pregnancy rate fell after that. To some extent, I'm more interested and in some ways more concerned about the effects of the whaling on the groups of females, because these groups are what we call social units, more or less family groups of about 10 females, and they're young. They live together. They depend on each other. These are ocean nomads, so they're swimming thousands of kilometers together. And the only constant thing in their environment are their social group, their social unit. These other females who they live with, who swim with them, and they babysit each other's young as they dive down deep for squid, and they suckle each other's young, and if they're attacked by predators, they will defend themselves communally. Also, and this particularly interests me, this is the major route by which information is flowing through the sperm society. So this gets into the culture idea. Right. So a young sperm whale learns from her mother how to be a sperm whale. As well as the other members of her family unit. And the concern is, and there's a bit of evidence for this, that by taking females out of these family units, by killing them, you not only reduce the numbers, but you reduced the effectiveness of their society, both for doing all these things like babysitting, defending against predators, and transferring information.
It seems that these the sperm whales as sea-dwelling creatures are much more similar to land creatures, terrestrial creatures like elephants. Do you think that similarity with us humans as well? Thinking about dialects, and you raised the issue of family groups, for example.
Yeah, the parallels between sperm whales and elephants are quite remarkable. I mean, these are, sometimes it seems to me that sperm whales are closer to elephants in so many characteristics than they are to any other creature in the ocean or on land. And why that is very interesting. Society and culture are very much interrelated. So culture is the flow of information by social learning, right? So it's what we learn from others and how we deal with it. So this means that the flow of culture, the way cultures are set up, depends on the society. And so I would expect elephants and sperm whales with pretty similar societies to have quite similar aspects of these. If you go to humans, our society is really differently set up. We don't have, usually, I mean, there are a few exceptions, those tight groups of females. In most traditional human societies, the females are transferring between groups, so they're not staying with close relatives. It's more a male-based society.
Someone said that there's the assumption, or that actually the different larger organizational groups, the larger populations in the same ocean, you could call something like nations. What do you think of that idea?
Yeah, well, we found these things called clans. So you have a bunch of social units. So the social unit, remember, is a family group, about 10 females and they're young. And each social unit is a member of a particular clan. And in any area, there may be 2 or more clans. And these clans, have really quite different behavior. They have different dialects. They have different ways of moving, of babysitting, and so on. And they're also quite xenophobic. So members of one clan don't hang out with the other clan, even though they live in the same area. So it's a kind of multicultural society, as we have in, especially I'm talking from Canada, and here, a city like Montreal is heavily multicultural. But I have friends who were brought up in English-speaking Montreal and friends who were brought up in French-speaking Montreal, and they, you know, as they were growing up, they didn't know anyone from the other societies, even though they're living right on top. And so it appears to me a somewhat parallel system here. And so, yeah, we're a bit careful not calling them nations or people or anything like that. But there are certainly similarities there. Yeah.
So that also reminds me of we have these populations with overlapping home ranges in British Columbia, for example, and they actually seem to be evading each other. They don't want to talk to other, they are conspecifics, but they have different cultures, they are different entities. You think sperm whales do see themselves as a we, as an us, as a defined, do they know where they stem from? And I'm assuming that they are easily recognizing like strange sperm whales.
Yeah, well, I think so. I mean, I haven't got really good proof of it. And some colleagues of mine have been trying playback experiments. So where you play back the sound of one clan to another clan and see how they react, right? So that's the bird scientists have been brilliant at this in figure, and even the elephant scientists have done some remarkable work, you know, with playbacks. And we've been trying it. Well, my colleagues have been trying it for about 20 years now, and we haven't had a whole lot of success. And I think this is mainly because we can't fool the sperm whales. They hear us making these sounds, and they don't say, "Ooh, there's a bunch of sperm whales from the other clan approaching." They think those bloody humans are trying to pretend they're us again, and so, react to So yeah, it's been a bit frustrating that, and but if you, because we love, or you know, we're biologists, we love experimental evidence. You play this and you play that, and they react this one way to this and one way to that, but we haven't got that yet. So we're trying to make inferences from what we hear and what we see. I mean, one really important and interesting difference between the orca situation and the sperm whale situation is that the orca one has gone so far that the different ecotypes you're talking about, the mammal-eating big killer whales or transient killer whales, and the salmon-eating resident killer whales mate within them. So a resident only mates with a resident, transient with a transient. Whereas in the sperm whale clans, it looks very much as though there is mating across the clans. So the big males, the males leave the mother's group, they go off to the Arctic and Antarctic, spend some time there, then they come back down to the tropics, you know, maybe 10, 15 years later. And at that point, they may mate, perhaps even preferentially mate, with females from another clan. So that means that the genes, well, the nuclear genes, the genes that go through both parents, get mixed up among the clans.
Mm-hmm. So our understanding that these are cultural animals with the clans and dialects and different traits of behavior, that has changed our view of these animals greatly. What does it mean for the conservation of those animals in times where they are threatened by a huge variety of things?
There are quite a number of implications for conservation. One is a good thing, and that because culture information can spread more quickly than genetic information, potentially animals can deal with changes in their environment more quickly than if they didn't have the culture. So if one animal figures out, okay, you know, because humans have messed up the climate or the environment, we no longer have as much of this to eat. Well, I tried this and it seems to work well, and that spreads through the population. So that, you know, that's actually a potentially good thing about culture when we're thinking about conservation. But there's a reverse side to that, and that's cultural conservatism. And so something that can take hold in cultural species is the idea that a particular kind of behavior or kinds of behavior represent us. So we were talking earlier about so the us versus them. So this is us. We do this, and we don't do that because those guys do that. And that means there can be an extreme reluctance to take up the new behavior. And there seems to be some evidence for this with the killer whales you were talking about on the west coast, that the salmon eaters particularly prefer Chinook salmon, and they love Chinook salmon, and they will eat other salmon, but they don't seem to like it all that much. But other salmon provide, good nutrients, but their populations rise and fall as the Chinook population rises and falls. So they don't seem very good at saying, oh, there's no Chinook around, we'll go and eat something else. And this came to the extreme when they were capturing the killer whales for the ocean area. And at that point, this was I think in the 60s or early 70s, and they just didn't know that there were different kinds of killer whales. They stuck them all in the net and they fed them all salmon. And some of the transient killer whales who were in that net, well, one of them died before eating any salmon, and the other one it finally did. But so it could eat salmon, but its culture was we don't eat salmon. That's what those guys do. So that's another aspect. So culture can help, or it can actually impede a population's response to changing environments. So, for instance, to climate change or overfishing or whatever else we're doing to the ocean. We're doing so much to the ocean. A third thing is the how we define what we are conserving. So conservation biologists have spent a lot of time trying to think about what are we trying to conserve. And the geneticists kind of took this over and developed the idea of evolutionarily significant units which have different genetic makeup, and these are what we're trying to conserve. My perspective, and I think that of a growing number of people, is that what we should be trying to conserve is the diversity of types of animal, types of behavior of the animal, what we call phenotypic diversity. And that phenotypic diversity is clearly, a lot of it's genetically determined, but can be determined by other processes, of which culture is the second most important. And so for cultural species like the sperm whales, but also like chimpanzees, like elephants and so on, we should not only be trying to conserve their genetic diversity, we should be trying to conserve their cultural diversity. And we can see we are trying to do this as humans. We are concerned, and we should be concerned about the loss of, say, languages, or the loss of dance steps, or loss of other cultural things that we as humans have developed. Because even though they may not seem terribly appropriate at the moment, they may be incredibly useful later on. And so, for instance, in the sperm whales, we have these two main clans we've studied off the Galapagos. So the sperm whales do much worse in the El Nino years, but we notice that the clan that tends to have higher feeding success in the normal cooler years now does worse in the El Nino year. So it gets reversed. So, as we warm up the oceans, it seems to me that we should try and make sure that the sperm whales have as much of this diversity of behavior out there, so that they can get their best shot at getting through it. And so for these species, like sperm whales, chimpanzees, and so on, we should be thinking about conserving cultural diversity as well as genetic diversity.
Sperm whales, they have the capability of producing extremely loud signals and vocalizations, and those might potentially hurt others simply because of the sound pressure they emit. But apparently they don't do that. Do you think there might be something like an etiquette in sperm whales that they know this should not be done, and um, thinking more in that direction, might there be something like a moral standard in sperm whales or other animals?
Yes, yeah, I think that's yeah, entirely probable. I mean, they make the loudest, most powerful sound of any creature, and it's highly directional. Just a few degrees, this beam of intense sound, which is finding, all the squid and stuff that they're going to eat. And so it's an incredibly useful system, but it seems to me it's a rather dangerous system too, as you noticed. And I kind of thinking of it like if you put a few some hunters in the forest with some machine guns, if they didn't have an etiquette about how they were going to use them, it could be pretty nasty. Yeah, I think it's reasonable to think this is the case. That they have this etiquette, so that when we're feeding together, we behave in a certain way so we don't injure each other.
Right, that's hugely interesting. Going back to the Essex case, you could call that a ship strike. Well, maybe just as a joke, because ship strikes nowadays are large ships hitting whales. Can you say something about that? I'm myself work in the Canary Islands, and there's a huge problem with the fast ferries, and it appears to me that large brain animals they should be able to detect these very loud vessels, and they also, in my eyes, should be able to realize where the ships come from, but apparently they don't. Do you know why? Can you imagine why that is?
First, I think we need to be careful here because we have never done intelligence tests on sperm whales. We don't have any definitive proof that they are intelligent, but I mean, we have all these correlates which strongly suggest they're intelligent. They have huge, highly structured brains, and across other species that works. Bigger brains, more complex brains tend to relate to better ability to do, to make cognitive decisions. They have complex social systems, which also correlate with cognitive ability. And as I think you mentioned, they also have complex cultures, which are a third correlation. So we suspect they are intelligent. I just pick up on one thing you said, fast, right? So the deal with ship strikes is that it depends a lot on how fast the ship is going. And a slow ship, a ship bumbling along at 6 knots, like we do, is unlikely to cause, if it does hit a sperm whale or another whale, is unlikely to cause serious damage to either the whale or the ship. A ship going along at 15 knots will probably kill the whale. And if it's going at 30 knots, which I suspect some of the fast ferries you watch off the Canaries are doing, then it's definitely going to kill the whale. So unless there's been evolutionary pressures to deal with this, in other words, if the ones who were unable to deal with this didn't pass on their genes or their culture, and so as you go through the generations, you end up with just animals who either have the genes which help them do this, maybe better awareness of sounds, or the culture that, yeah, we keep an ear open for whatever's going on out there and get out the way if we hear it. It's entirely possible that it just hasn't got through to them yet, and because it does happen, but it isn't happening enough so that it's a selective force.
Right, and after all, they didn't have the chance to adapt to something that evolutionary is extremely new. I mean, sperm whales are millions of years old, and fast ferries or fast moving ships are maybe 50 years old. So there is no chance to have a learning process that goes deep into their culture and their capability to appropriately react, especially younger animals who are sometimes just playing around and being not too cautious about what they're doing, and they seem to be hit more frequently.
Maybe I can just mention something we've just found, which is kind of runs a little bit against this, but it is, I think, very interesting. We've looked at the logbooks of the whalers from the 1820s, so exactly the period of the Essex. And if you look at their success at catching whales that they saw, given that they saw them, what's the probability they caught one? It goes down by over 50% within 3 years in the North Pacific. So, you know, something's happening there. and my guess, well, and it's backed up by a bit of by the data, is that the groups were learning from each other. So these family groups, the social units, come together and move together. And so what we're thinking is that if a social unit is attacked by whalers, it learns that there are ways to reduce your risk here. I mean, there's obvious ways. You swim upwind, you dive, maybe you fight back. And the most obvious thing you do is you don't do what you used to do with killer whales, which is gather at the surface. That's how they defend themselves against killer whales. They form a nice tight group, put the baby in the middle, and fight with their flukes and their jaws against the killer whales attacking. And it works fairly well. But it's the very worst thing to do if you meet Captain Ahab with a harpoon, because you're all stuck there in a group and he's got a nice big target to aim at and he gets you and he'll get several of you. So the suggestion is these whales learn very quickly not to do that and perhaps to do some of the other things. And then they passed it on.
Do you think all cetaceans have culture?
Yeah, I suspect so. The more I don't know. Obviously, we don't know much about pygmy right whales and dum-de-dum. But the more we look across the animal kingdom, we find culture. So people are finding, you know, so culture is based on social learning, animals learning from other animals. And what one finds is that, yeah, obviously it's most obvious and most expected in extremely social species. Species like sperm whales, orcas, elephants, chimpanzees, some of the corvid birds, you know, crows and ravens and things like that. But also, we do find cultures that are important. They're a bit less prominent, but they are important in species which aren't terribly social. So take an orangutan. An orangutan is a much less social species than a chimpanzee. But they've identified a whole range of cultural behaviors in orangutans. Not many of them are social because they're not terribly social, but they do meet enough to learn from each other, and they make a big point of doing that. And in particular, the younger orangutan learns from her mother or his mother how to do a bunch of stuff. So my guess is that the same is true for a lot of the cetaceans. So species which we often see just by themselves have quite a lot of their behavior which they've learned from others, or probably in those cases much of it from their mothers, right, but not necessarily all of it. And so yes, they are cultural. Maybe for these species that the significance of culture for their behavior is a bit less than it is for an orca or a sperm whale or a bottlenose dolphin, but I suspect it's still pretty significant.
Right. Thank you. Some nowadays call for rights for cetaceans or rights for other animals. given that they have these high capabilities, cognitive capabilities, they are cultural animals, they show something like personhood, even self-awareness. What do you think about this idea of giving rights to cetaceans or animals?
Yeah, well, I think we should try and be consistent and think about why we give rights to humans. And some would say we give rights to humans because of human DNA, which is a bit silly, really. But it's also not actually true, because we don't give full rights to people who are brain dead, or for lumps of hair on a barber shop floor, which have lots of human DNA. Or in many societies to partially developed fetuses. So we need to think about how we decide which of those groups, which all have human DNA in them, we do give rights and which we don't, and then how we allocate that. And philosophers have done a lot of this, and this is their business really. But as they go about their work, they need information from science to guide their deliberations. And yeah, so I think some of the things you talked about are some of the things that seem to be behind how we decide how to give rights to humans. Things like self-awareness, sociality, and so on. So it seems to me, from I'm not a philosopher, but reading what they're doing and knowing a bit about the science that they're basing their work on, that this is justified. That cetaceans, but not just cetaceans, but there are other animals. Depending on which criteria you bring in. But if you bring in things like self-awareness, certain levels of cognition, certain levels of sociality, then certainly cetaceans come in, but also animals like chimps and elephants, and probably others as well.
My last question, referring to sperm whales, would be, if you put yourself into the perspective of a whale, of a sperm whale, what would be your message to us?
Well, I think even though I now, as a sperm whale, have an extraordinary system for sensing the ocean, for getting my food, and so on, it's not easy. I have to deal with things like El Nino. I have to deal with things like the fact that the squid that I eat are extremely variable in occurrence. I have to deal with natural predators like killer whales. And please don't make anything harder for us. It's pretty difficult as it is. And you've reduced our populations by a large amount. And you've destroyed some of our societies. So if you can back off a bit, that would be lovely.